In the previous lecture, we spent a little bit of time testing out the navbar component. In this lecture, we're going to focus on a much more exciting component, and that is the post writer component, which is ultimately used to compose these posts. If we head over to new post, we can see it in action. You can see it uses Markdown, so I can go ahead and create a title, and that's going to give me a H1. And it's also going to have a very cool feature, which is going to be syntax highlighting. So that's something we'd like to make sure we're effectively testing as well. Let's go ahead and get started with this test. And this really shows some of the benefits of Cypress and the visual interface. You could write a test like this using something like Jest and JSDOM, but it's going to be much easier if we can actually see what's going on. So I think this is a great candidate for a Cypress test. Let's go ahead and get started by copy and pasting an existing spec file and updating this one. I'm going to call this one postwriter.sci.ts. The next thing we're going to do is just quickly update all of our imports and delete all of the code that we don't need. Let's go ahead now and give this one a try. We are getting an error. It says cannot read properties of undefined reading title. If we head over to the postwriter component, we can probably figure out what's going on. What's happening is we're not passing in the correct props. Post is undefined, so when we do props.post.title, it's attempting to access a property on an undefined object. There are definitely ways to improve the type safety of this and get this warning before we run the test. We may look into those a little bit later on. For now, let's just go ahead and pass in our props. This is a Vue-specific function. If you're using React, you can actually just pass in the prop like this, and it's going to work just fine. Because we're using Vue, we do need to use this props argument down here, or alternatively use JSX. I'm going to go with this one for now, just because I'm used to it. We're going to pass in our post here, and this is going to be today. And this is a very simple example post I prepared earlier. Just to show you how it works, I'm going to come over here. It's just a very simple empty post. So now that we've got that, we still have an error. We need to update our mount function. Again, we're going to focus on type safety later on. For now, we're just going to pass in options the second argument, and then we're going to spread it over here. That should hopefully be enough to get everything working, and I promise we'll come back and make this nice and type safety later on. Either way, our error is now gone, so we can start writing some tests. What we need to do is type into this input and then assert that the correct HTML is generated. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we're going to do is head over to our component and figure out how we're actually going to select this input. If I scroll down a little bit inside of my template, we can see the content editable is right here. I'm just going to give this a quick data size selector just to make it easy to select this one. Definitely would consider perhaps an accessibility selector in the future, but this is good for an example. Now that we've got that, let's head over to our postwriter component and start writing some tests. We're going to start off with sci.get, and we're just going to attempt to select this one correctly. Let's go ahead and paste that one in. Then we're going to clear it out, and then we're going to type something. Let's start off with a H1, so it's going to be a single hashtag, and we're just going to say title. If everything works correctly, this should generate a H1 in our HTML. Let's save it off and give it a try. I'm actually getting a warning because I didn't save my other file, and now that is hopefully working correctly. We are missing some of our styling, unfortunately. I'll fix that up in just a moment after we write the assertion. So if everything is working correctly, there should be a H1, and that one should contain the correct text, which is going to be title, and that is going to pass. The next thing we're going to do is fix up our styling. The problem is I created some extra HTML, or some CSS rather, inside of my app view, and this has not been applied in my component test. Just to save a little bit of time and simplify it, I'm just going to copy and paste this one and go straight over to my component index.html and paste it up the top. We could probably make a shared script or something that we import, but I think for simplicity's sake, this is going to be just fine. If we save that off, we are now getting the correct styling, which is pretty nice. The next thing we're going to do is continue on with our tests. I'd like to make sure that it's working for a paragraph tag as well. So in this case, I'm going to just type in, let's just say some content. I'm going to say content, and that is going to appear inside of a p tag. This is going to work just fine. The next thing I'd like to do is test out syntax highlighting with my code snippet. So let's go ahead and do that as well. Again, it's going to be very similar, but it's a little bit more complex. We need to make sure we're correctly simulating what a real user would be doing. In this case, I'm going to use an array, 3 backticks. We're then going to have our function const foo. It's just going to be a very basic function that returns a bar, and then we're going to finish up with 3 more backticks. Finally, we're going to join those up with carriage returns. And this is going to simulate what a user would be doing when they type all of this into their input. Let's go ahead and close that one off. And just to make it a bit more readable, I'm going to put this on separate lines. Finally, we should be able to assert the correct text or the correct code is rendered. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this one off. It is going to fail at first. Of course, this assertion is incorrect. And what we can do is actually use the selector playground to find out what kind of elements we're dealing with. I can see here I have a code element, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this one just to save me typing a little bit of code. Inside of here, we should be able to find const foo is equal to bar. So let's just go ahead and give that one a try. Going to copy and paste this one down here. If everything went according to plan, the code snippet should indeed contain this code. So let's go ahead and save that one off and see what happens. This is actually going to pass, which is really nice. And this is really convenient as well. You can just use the selector playground here to see what elements are available if you're not sure how to write your assertion. Now the final thing I'd like to test is what happens when we click on Save Post. Let's go ahead and take a look at the component and see what happens. We head over here and find the submit button. It's going to be this handle click function. And if we head over to the handle click function, what it's going to do is check if there's a user. If there's not, we're going to get an error. Otherwise, we're going to construct a new post, which has all of the new data, the new content and HTML. And then we're going to emit an event. So we're going to assert that the correct event is emitted with the correct payload. Let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we're going to do is head over here. And I'm just going to jump down here and grab my select my button, and then we're going to look for one that contains save post. And finally, we are going to click it and see what happens. We are getting an error. We scroll down, it says user was not found. What's happening is exactly what it says. User is undefined, so it's going to throw this error. We've actually seen how to solve this earlier inside of our navbar component. We just need to make sure our user is authenticated. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come down. I'm actually going to do this right at the top. We're going to go ahead and import our user store. So I'm going to say user store is equal to use users. Now that we have the user store, we just need to go ahead and set the current user ID. I'm just going to make that 1. Finally, let's save it off and see what happens. And that is now passing. The final thing I'd like to do is make an assertion to ensure the correct arguments are getting emitted from this. It's going to be the latest content. Again, we're going to use that pattern I showed you earlier, which is going to be the parent wrapper component. Let's go ahead and create a new component called parent, and this is just going to be created with define component, which is going to be imported from Vue. Next thing we're going to do is create our template, and that's just going to have our post writer. So I'm going to go ahead and say post writer. It is going to have a single post, which is going to be called post. I'm going to define that one in just a moment inside of here. And we also need to make sure we're registering our component. So let's go ahead and register the post writer component. Final thing we're going to need to do is return this post inside of a setup function just to make it available on the template. So let's go ahead and return. I'm just going to say post is equal to today. Finally, we can go ahead and update this as well. I'm going to remove my props argument and just pass in the parent, and we're not going to need any arguments for that second object. Let's save it off and see what happens. With a bit of luck, this is still going to pass. The final thing we need to do is actually assert that the correct data is emitted. We're going to do this by using a stub. I'm going to jump up here and say const, let's call it submit, and that's going to be equal to sci.stub. It's going to allow us to observe the data that gets emitted. The next thing we're going to need to do is listen for that event on submit, and then we're just going to call that submit function, which we're going to need to return. Finally, we can make an assertion. Let's go ahead and try that out. If we scroll right down to the bottom, we can use then to make sure the event has been emitted before we make an assertion. And I'm just going to expect submit to have been called. If everything goes according to plan, this should pass. And so it does. If we scroll down here, we can see the assertion is correct. The final thing I like to do is assert it's called with the correct arguments. Just to verify what the correct arguments are, I'm going to head back to my post writer and scroll right up to the top. And we can see here inside of define emits, it is supposed to be a post. Let's go ahead and write that assertion. I'm going to create a new post here, which is going to be a post interface. Just to show you where this came from, it was automatically imported, and that came from the same place as today. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can go ahead and start writing our expected post. I'm actually going to call this one expected. It's a bit more descriptive. Now we're going to go ahead and define this one. Just a bit of a trick to show you exactly what is being emitted. What you can do is scroll up to the top and change this. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and do a console log instead of a stub. And that's going to easily let me see the arguments that are being emitted. If I head back to my console now, we can see here they are. To save a little bit of time, I'm just going to go ahead and copy these. It's going to be much easier. We paste those in, which should get us pretty close to complete. The next thing we just need to do is go ahead and add some commas. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And now that we've done that, we have one more error to solve, which is this created date. This is going to be a bit of a problem, as date times are. They're going to change constantly. The reason this is going to change constantly, if we head up to the top and have a look at today, is that this is going to be different every time this test runs. Instead, what we're going to do is create a function that allows us to configure the date time ourselves. I'm going to say export const create post. It's going to take an argument of a date time. So we're going to say date time to make it a string, and it is going to return a post. Finally, we can go ahead and return all the information that we need. So I'm just going to go ahead and return. I'm going to return today actually. It's going to save us a lot of time. Can go ahead and spread over today. And then we're going to pass in our date time, which is going to be created. Let's go ahead and rename that one as well. It's going to give us a very easy way to configure the post and make sure the created date is going to be consistent. Let's save it off and update our test. If we head back here, I'm going to replace this today with create post. It's going to go ahead now and update this one as well. We're going to say const post is equal to create post, and we're going to pass in our own date time. Let's go ahead and delete that one. And I'm just going to go ahead and say date time, which is going to come from Luxon. Then we're going to say now, and then we're going to say to ISO. Finally, we can go ahead and update this as well and pass in our post. The last thing we need to do is change this. We are going to use our stub again. And finally, we're going to have a consistent way to assert against our date time. All we need to do is scroll down here and change the assertion. This is now going to become post.created. That should be enough to get everything passing. Unfortunately, we have an error because I missed a comma. Final thing is we're going to assert this was called with expected, and with a bit of luck, this is going to pass, and that is going to give us all the tests that we need. As expected, this does pass. Everything is working exactly how it should be. As one final check, I'm going to go ahead and change this one just to make sure that it does fail for the right reason, and so it is. Everything is now working correctly. This was quite a bit of work, but we've actually managed to get 100% test coverage. I've covered the entire functionality in a single test. You could also go ahead and continue improving this. And one final thing I'd like to show you is the Cypress Viewport function. I can go ahead and say Cypress Viewport and make this one a little bit wider just to show how it's actually going to be for a real user. Left and right, and this is how I expect everything to look. And now we have a nice little environment to iterate on our styling as well, kind of like you would with Storybook. We can see Cypress was a really good fit for this very visual component, and I'm pretty happy with how this test turned out. It is a little bit long, but we got a lot of coverage for relatively little code, and I'm fairly confident everything is now working correctly.